We can now come on to the next part of the second section. This means we are talking about this location. It's so the university's auditorium in this former Dominican building, both the building itself and its connection to climate change. And for this I welcome Drewello and Leander Pallas. Mr. Drewello worked as a conservator for natural stone and terracotta at the Bavarian State Office for Monument Preservation from 1982 to 1986. After that he studied chemistry and computer science as a minor at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, and then graduated as a chemical engineer. In 1998 he earned his doctorate on the topic of microbially-induced corrosion of silicate glass, and subsequently took over the management of the Natural Science Lab at the German National Museum in Nuremberg. Following that, he assumed the professorship for restoration science and monument preservation at the Otto Friedrich University in Bamberg. And he was also the spokesperson for the newly founded Center of Competence for Monument Sciences and Technologies from 2016 to 2021. Leander Pallas studied monument preservation at the Otto Friedrich University in Bamberg from 2018 to 2021, and wrote a master's thesis on the topic of monitoring as a concept of recreation and cultural heritage, using the example of the former Dominican church in Bamberg. And since March 2021, he has been a research associate for non-destructive technologies at the Professorship of Restoration Science at this competence center. And I would like to invite both of you to the front, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much for the introductory words. And when Paul asked me to speak about the auditorium and climate change, I seriously considered if I was the right speaker for it, because of course I can tell you a lot about the auditorium, but the auditorium and climate change are two topics that are not necessarily in harmony. But then I thought there are indeed 3 points of connection that I can address here. The first point is quite interesting. It's the acoustic, which is really bad here. There is no other way to put it. This bad acoustic is, of course, a consequence of the construction measures that took place in the auditorium, but not just during our time, but also in the past. I think the best way to address this topic is to view the issue of climate change and its impact on such a building with some distance. Standing here, we tend to have a tunnel vision, and one of mine is, of course, the technology, the implementation, and the searching for solutions, which is, of course, an important matter, which has to be done as well. And however, the term adaptation to climate change is one that I struggle with, because the idea that we have to adapt to climate change or adjust our measures to it is almost a sophistical question. And nevertheless, the auditorium already has connections to the topic of climate change. And sometimes I've thought that if we're talking about conservation techniques and tunnel vision, then we should also talk about the tunnel visions of our own discipline. For me, as a former professor of restoration science and monument preservation, the auditorium is a special place, but it's not just interesting for me. I believe that it's also intriguing to everyone who has worked and studied at this university and had to engage with this auditorium at some point. The tunnel vision lies in the fact that this auditorium is a concentration of evidence, and this concentration of evidence becomes interesting when one can understand what is meant by it. However, if we have a population that can no longer read or doesn't want to read anymore, then we have a real problem. And this is indeed the case. it was, of course, one of the foundations of our job that we have to do here as part of the postgraduate, master's, and doctoral program in monument preservation, to try to raise awareness and make people open up to these issues. And I'm not just talking about those who are professionally interested in it and write theoretical volumes, but also the average person just walking through the street into this building. Next door there is the Schenkala pub, which is certainly better attended than the auditorium at this point. I've been asked to say a few words about the auditorium and its background, and I'm happy to do that. So we must not forget that the auditorium was actually a gift, and the university has had a terrible auditorium located slightly outside in the east of Bamberg, and then was offered this building in 1998 or 1999 for exactly €1 million. So an entire building, and they had 1 million at their disposal. And then a minimum measure was carried out to put the building into function, or at least to operate it. That means that events could then take place here. And dear students, you know that you have a certain entitlement to temperatures during exams, and those must be maintained, which means that the auditorium has to be heated. And to implement that was difficult. We also talked about, Mrs. Fuhrmann, you talked about politics and how to engage politics, and I have some advice for you. Invite politicians into a building where this does not properly function yet, and then you might portray the politicians in the right light. Then arrange a champagne reception, and just as the government president of the Upper Franconia raises his glass, a piece of plaster falls from the ceiling and lands right into his champagne glass. We actually managed to do that, and after that piece of plaster fell into the glass, suddenly funds became available for the auditorium. And we could think more generously and present the auditorium with a new face. But not as you see it now, though. Each of us has their own perception and imagination of what they see, and I think that there are no people who have the same vision and feeling of what they actually see and hear here in this auditorium. Therefore, I believe that we must consider and relate to the individual aspects of those people present in this auditorium, and then think about what we want to convey, what we say, and what we want to say. I can only tell you one thing. For example, if you go to the basement with the former city heritage conservator of Bamberg, then you will notice that under this auditorium is probably the very first marketplace of Bamberg, because the auditorium didn't exist back then. The Dominicans moved here first in 1320, and then they decided to build a church here. But the church wasn't built as you see it now. It was actually a small church. And this church was located 90 degrees at a different angle, with just three naves, so it was not more than that. And only in 1400 did the Dominicans buy more land, push the population out of the old town area, and then build this church. And then the findings began. So forgive me if I get excited about this, but coming from the field of stone wall paintings and plaster, it's a dream for me when you look up at the walls, and what you see there, the structure is the original plaster from 1400, and you can still observe the boundaries of the day's work. But you have to be told in order to see it, so you have to be pointed to it. And what you see there is the plaster from 1400, and that hasn't been changed. The texture on the surface is not that of a 20th century new construction, so smooth, boring, polyurethane painted with regular paint. Instead, it's the old structure with the respective scaffold boundaries. if you take a step further and consider why the auditorium is now the way it is, then you have to forgive us, because we had nothing to do with all this renovation. The auditorium was never completely wide. It was never furnished with such a floor, with underfloor heating. It was never this high, and it never had an opening that is now used as a coat room. It never had barrier-free access. And the auditorium was structured completely differently in the past. So why did the university buy the auditorium? It was because the city of Bamberg decided to provide a home for the Bamberg Symphony Orchestra and build a concert hall for them. And until then, the Bamberg Symphony Orchestra had been present in the city's cultural space and gave their concerts here. And now I have to reveal myself as a local. And even though we, let's say, have our problems with this very Catholic city of Bamberg, this auditorium was a real important place in the city. And for the young me back then, with 15 or 16 years old, it was a dream. Back then you had to sit behind one of these columns for 5 German marks and listen to the Bamberg Symphony Orchestra. You never saw anything, but you heard them. However, even back then, the acoustics were so bad. The musicians of the symphony orchestra have told the following story. So the symphony orchestra actually came to Bamberg due to an extreme weather event. Otherwise, they would have never ended up here. But there was also something called the Second World War, and there was a city called Prague that had a philharmonic orchestra, and this philharmonic orchestra was transferred to Bamberg. And they have then been here since that time and are now also world leading, I have to say, with Jakob Buscher and the conductors currently in the orchestra. It's just a dream. And yes, so the orchestra was housed here in this building, and since 1948 they played, and back then they were specialized in Bruckner, Mahler and Wagner, which are not necessarily the easiest symphonies to play. And in the auditorium there was a reverberation time of 7 to 8 seconds. So the conductor always had to think, how do I now actually conduct? How do I play? And to deal with that, the walls were draped with curtains, so you never actually knew what was behind these curtains. You could only see the curtains, you could see the orchestra and the sound funnel. And then the symphony orchestra changed, and the poor university, the very poor university, because every university is poor, maybe except maybe for the Technical University of Munich. So the University of Bamberg got this building then, and they thought to make this auditorium a meeting place, a place where people come together. And they hired a Munich architecture firm that dreamed of a completely white auditorium with a so-called cellar. And the cellar, this is the irony of the story, was supposed to improve the acoustics so that one could have effortless conversations in here. But as you can see now, it didn't necessarily succeed. So I can tell you it's truly ironic, but I hope that Paul and those who are active here at the university will achieve something someday, convincing the president and the chancellor, so the one in charge of finances, that this can't go on like this. Because we rely on communication, we need to understand each other, and it's utter nonsense to save money on these things. Yes, so that simply doesn't work, but we're out of the picture here because we weren't asked about it. Before the symphony orchestra came here, it was dirty in the auditorium. It was cold. But then when they came, still the music was amazing. And then this auditorium had something else. So my colleague, the advocate for modern monument preservation, said there used to be a gallery in the auditorium that was built in the 1960s during the time of the symphony orchestra. And until today, I don't understand why they actually demolished this gallery, because if they had kept it, then they would have had an additional opportunity to place an audience there and simply listen. But as you see, you can't see the gallery anymore because it's gone. So what you now see at the back, the remnants, they were added during the Baroque period for installing church organs. Before the symphony orchestra, there was the cultural shock of Bamberg in 1805, which was the secularization in a city with not even 40,000 inhabitants, and something that felt like 100 Catholic church. I think there were 28 in total, which is already quite a lot. And the citizens of Bamberg sent the 7 remaining Dominicans to Kloster Langenheim near Viertenheiligen, and then made these buildings available for social housing. Only then a passage was made so that the Schlenkerla pub can now operate its beer garden. So it was 7 Dominicans, and until then the Baroque concept of the Dominicans here was leading. And that means painting everything white 6 times. What you see now in terms of color or wall paintings, which we of course love above all, and there's a lot to tell about that from the year 1400 to the year 1540. Now there are a total of 6 different layers of paint, all paid to by so there are 6 different layers of paint, and you simply have to say it bluntly about the Dominicans, but they created outstanding works of art. And until then, you didn't really know what was underneath the white paint. But in the 1930s, we don't necessarily want to talk about the bad times in Bamberg too much, but in 1930, they ripped out the military camp that had been established here after secularization and realized that there is something colorful under the surfaces. And then they wanted to expose the true Middle Ages and chipped off the first layer of paint. And at some point, the state office said, stop, there are more layers, and we are going to uncover a part of that. And so what was uncovered is the so-called Kömmernis, which you can't see on this side. Although, what's also the irony of the story is that these walls are movable, and in principle you could tip them up, but it's a really hard task for the janitors, because unfortunately it doesn't work virtually or however else, but you have to move them physically and mechanically. But otherwise you could actually move these walls and have a more open spatial feelings, according to the architect. And by the way, the architect wanted to paint over all the findings and wall paintings in white, of course, with a protective layer in between. But we said, you know what, since the year 2000, we've had 6 master's theses, 2 doctoral theses, and collaboration with Erfurt University and Applied Sciences here. And now we're supposed to paint over what we have uncovered? Are you out of your mind? And only then we could convince the architect to leave it open. What I mean to say is that talking, communicating, and raising awareness for the matter is a damn complicated project. But it has to be done, and sometimes we have to be obstinate. So please don't stick anything on the walls, because yes, it's all very delicate. So the layers of paint are very delicate, and I think that my colleague can tell you a bit more about that, but please don't do it, because then you'll just remove even more layers, and under these old layers of paint everything's still preserved. So a note on the acoustics. If you want to experience a nearly identical church, almost exactly the same, operated as a music academy, then you should go to Alsace, to Gipfela, where you will see an almost identical Dominican church, which was built 40 years earlier and still has the old furnishings. So this means the root screen is still in the church, and the ceiling is not a Baroque ceiling. It's open to the roof truss. Other than that, nothing else has been altered. There is still a gallery in the church, and you can attend music concerts there, and I don't need a microphone there to communicate. It's fantastic. So go there, attend a concert in that music academy, and then look at the wall paintings, the colorful juxtaposition of different eras, and then ask yourself, what is it that made the Bamberger Dominicans and all subsequent generations decide to make a clean slate here? They removed the root screen, the galleries were removed, furnishings disappeared, and these were extreme events. Sorry, they couldn't have done anything else. There is one single book left from the well-known Bamberger Dominican library, or there is only one book left. The rest was used by the citizens of Bamberg to fill potholes in the street. And that's how it was viewed from Michelsberg, and the Benedictines looked down and thought, what is our population doing to the city? Churches were torn down. The Max Square had a huge church with a huge graveyard, but they no longer exist today. It's now one of the ugliest squares in the whole of Bamberg. So, in summary, what does all of this have to do with climate change? Perhaps let's take a leap to a higher level. On the one hand, we have an incredible stock, even if it doesn't look like it. We have an incredible stock and we need technical methods to protect it. So that's why you have to endure the cold in here, because we're not able to heat. And that's logical, of course, also for conservation reasons. So you simply have to swallow it and accept it. And by the way, in the church in Gipfela, at the concerts, there is no heating either. Yeah, so second, we have to take care of the climate. We have to take care of the use of space, and we have to make sure that some person doesn't come along and slide cards against the wall, thereby destroying the remaining wall paintings. So we simply have to watch out for that, and the technology has to be right. We need to know what we can do and what we should do, and that's simply important. But then, again, regarding climate change, and I also asked Ralph and the Keres working group to think about this, Bamberg would not be Bamberg if there hadn't been the so-called warm period in the Middle Ages, because we must never forget that. And our climate was never consistent, and from a geological perspective, it's just changing slowly. But still, we're living in a post-ice age, and if there are climate fluctuations here, we also have to put them in the right context. Nevertheless, the human-made climate change cannot be denied, and anyone who denies it must be quite blind. There is no other way to say it. And so as you showed beautifully in your lecture, especially in English park landscapes, or in terms of park landscapes, it's a disaster. So it's the same with the groove. It's like that, but man-made. So what does man-made anyway? Man-made means that people unfortunately decide based on their interests and population growth, which is insane and which this planet cannot handle. And one thing is that I believe is I believe that what the rarest asset was in our time and in previous times is that of making rational decisions. So rational decisions mean that people come together and find a solution because they have identified a problem. They will never work through any congresses, never in life. And in my opinion, it only works through direct examples. And the direct example, that's what you have to show. To write for a community that is no longer willing to read and only write for specialists, everyone has their tunnel vision, which is well-founded, and I love it, but it doesn't help. So we need real examples. And we simply have to show how it can be done and what makes these buildings so valuable, and that is talking. So the most beautiful collaboration, the most beautiful experience here in the Dominican Church was working with the computer scientists and the psychologists. That was excellent. Regular tours of the wall paintings were conducted, children's groups were interviewed, and experts were consulted. And average consumers were forced into the church. And they were asked to come here and to tell us what they see. And then this was all recorded, and the results The results were incredible, including the doctoral thesis by Stefanie Heuer, a psychologist. So the expert, just like all of us are, Thomas, me, you, Paul, they looked at the wall paintings, glanced over them, and knew everything. And then they left. The experts were finished first with everything, although they didn't interpret anything correctly. It was very lovely. So anyway, what is the Kümmernis, or what is the strange figure behind you? What is this crucified woman or man or bearded woman or maybe even genderqueer person? Yeah, it is a bearded woman. In the 14th century, it was one of the central points here in the church. And it was a processional point from Italy to Amsterdam. And people came here to Bamberg just to see this altar. The most interesting part were the children, because you have to take your time for them. And the children were the most interesting because they only looked at certain parts. The part that we intentionally left incomplete. The part that we painstakingly restored over 3 years didn't even interest them at all. And they didn't even look at it. But then we talked about it. And that's why I always think that the central problem is education. Whether it's further education, training, professional development, or whatever, or direct conversation, when you do that and create enthusiasm in the average consumer, then we may eventually achieve that insight and reason will prevail. But thank goodness there is an active professorship here that can do that. And I think, Leander, that you can demonstrate technical solutions 10 times better. So if there are any questions, we can talk about them later, and then there will be a coffee break, as we already said. But I hope that you have gained a first impression of this auditorium and understand why we have such problems here for which we are not responsible, such as acoustics, for example. Okay, thank you. Exactly, so now I would like to tell you something about the monitoring that we are conducting here. And then I'll refer back to Rainer, especially to the renovations that started in 2009 and also influenced the floor here. So the heating system with underfloor heating and recirculation heating that was installed has now led us to notice especially during winter events that the climate here is very dry. So here on the left you can see the standard version, the standard view that you had during the COVID-19 phase. And it was already mentioned that, for example, the temperature needs to be over 20 degrees. Which means that the entire room was continuously heated to 20 degrees. So what you can see here are the recordings. They are quite small, but you can see here that we begin in May 2020 and stay relatively consistent, just above 20 degrees until now. And here we have a small bend, which I'll explain later. But until the end of 2022, we always stayed above 20 degrees. And the blue line indicates the humidity. So the humidity varies a lot between summer and winter, so meaning between a no heating period and the heating period. And during the heating period, the relative humidity is always below 40%. So here we have drawn the line a bit larger. And you can see that from November to April, we rarely exceed 40% relative humidity. And this becomes dramatic in January and February. So sometimes it even goes down to 15%, and last year it may have even reached a value as low as 13% relative humidity. Another problem caused by the heating system is the high fluctuation. So we see many of these peaks here, and of course this is all over a very long period of time. That means that we don't see how short-term it actually is. But if you look at the data, you can see that there are fluctuations of over 30% relative humidity within up to 8 hours. So what does this mean for the paintings? So here we have two pictures. And here this means that we have a constant intake and release of water, and that the volume of each layer changes, especially with the paintings. As I mentioned before, we have many layers on top of each other with different compositions of materials. All of which absorb and release moisture, humidity differently. Also at different speeds and volumes. So they expand and contract constantly, which then leads to fatigue. And ultimately small patches of paint layer then fall off, as you can see here in the right picture, and this is not staged, so you can take a look during the coffee break later and just go along the edge of the wall, and there you will find these little tiles of paint still falling off. Then the question arose how we can investigate or monitor what exactly is happening and to what extent. So we decided on a monitoring system using a structured light scanner that we already had the professorship in which we had already tested. So it captures surfaces entirely non-contact, so by not touching the wall. It does that in the sub-millimeter range with a point spacing of 100 micrometers, and a point deviation of 20 micrometers. So this is very precise on a relatively large area. And then we selected the surfaces, and the stripe light scanner has a projector and a camera and projects the stripe pattern as seen here onto the object. So the camera then captures the curvature and can determine the individual surface points using something called triangulation. So to do that, we take one scan, then we move the scanner, and then we take another scan. We then overlap these two scans, which allows us to capture relatively large areas in a relatively short period of time. So we then decided to overlay these 3D scans, and you can stack them on top of each other and then display deviations in a false color image. So on the top left we have a photograph of the niche directly on the west wall, on the right side, or on the left for you. And here we have the corresponding 3D scan. So maybe you can see that here we can see a certain strength of these 3D scans, because we can do that without any color information. That means that we can see the surface structure very precisely and are not distracted by color deviations, which is particularly helpful in these questions. So we conduct one scan, and then after a certain period we conduct a second one. Then we overlay these two scans, and then we see here on the right side that yellow to red indicates the positive range, and turquoise to blue indicates the negative range. So we can see whether something is bulging forward or receding, even if something has fallen off. And in that case, we have a lot of loss on the surface, which is indicated by a deep blue color. And if something bulges forward, then it appears red. And we can already see here in the smallest areas that something is happening on these wall paintings. So we decided to conduct the scans on various reference surfaces. So there are three surfaces on the west side, one to your left and two to your right on the east side. And these reference surfaces vary in their state of preservation. So some are very stable with hardly any loose paint layers, but then we also have others with loose layers. And then there is also some that have already undergone previous investigations. So these were scanned once, and at the time we perform a scan annually. And we also do this as part of a lecture here in the winter semester. I've already seen some students here who conducted these measurements last winter semester. Then we can compare the scans annually or over a longer period of time and precisely what happens. So the comparison on the left side is from 2022 to 2023, where we can already see some movement beneath these paint layers, although there are no cracks or anything like that. But it still seems that there is a certain dynamic. But if we look at the entire period since we started scanning in 2020, then we can observe more changes, especially In the lower area, we can see entire patches that have fallen off. And this also happened partly on the surfaces. Here we can see that this particular patch is detaching further from the surface. So we performed this analysis on 5 reference surfaces, but I won't go into detail about each of them because we always have relatively different results that we have to work with. Surface 3, for example, gave us a very stable impression, and not much happened here, but in the last year we larger findings gradually emerged that indicate that something is still happening. And to interpret all of this, we place it in the context of the indoor climate, as I showed earlier. We have a climate diagram that shows what happened between 2 of these scan recordings in terms of the climate, which then provides us with a basis for interpretation.